everyone, and welcome. I'm really glad you can join us today. My name is Ray, and I'm your host for today's Infor webinar series. Today, we're diving into a topic that's foundational to so much of what we do with the Infor Cloud platform, Infor OS API Gateway. Now, let's talk about today's topic. Our session is titled Managing API with API Gateway. API Gateway is one of those capabilities that often sits quietly in the background, but it plays a critical role in secure, governed integrations across Infor applications and third-party services. Today's session will explore how organizations can standardize API access, accelerate automation, and reduce integration risk using a single gateway layer for publishing, securing, and managing APIs in production. Whether you're working in integration architecture, automation strategy, or platform governance, this session should give you practical insight and implementation perspective. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. Just a quick note for those of you viewing the session on On24. Google Chrome is the preferred browser, and you'll see a set of widgets along the bottom of your screen that'll let you customize your view or expand the presentation to full screen using the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. The media player widget controls the audio, so if you don't hear anything, that's the first place to check. If you experience any technical issues, try refreshing your browser by pressing F5, or use the help widget in the bottom of the toolbar. For those of you watching on YouTube or LinkedIn, these platform controls won't apply, but feel free to use the comments if you have any questions. Before we jump into the main part of today's session, I want to take a few minutes to point out something you'll find in the Infor developer community. They're the challenges. These were originally introduced at TechX, and a lot of people have been using them as a hands-on way to explore different parts of the Infor platform. Oh yes, one more note. While this session is pre-recorded, we will be fielding all your questions, and at the end, our guest speaker and I will be live answering as many as we can. So please stick around. I also want to remind everyone that all the questions submitted today, along with the answers, will be posted in the Infor developer community. You can find them at the URL shown here on the screen. This makes it easy to revisit the discussion, share with your team, and continue the conversation after today's session. You'll also see on this slide our top 3 community contributors. We're fortunate to have experts who constantly share their knowledge and help others across the platform. And if you look closely, you might notice that today's presenter happens to be sitting at the very top of the list as the #1 contributor. So clearly, he doesn't just talk about API gateways, he answers questions about it at all hours too. I'm very happy to introduce today's presenter, Brandon Watson, VP of Cloud Suite Solutions at Tridex Systems. Brandon has been with Tridex for more than 19 years and specializes in Infor OS and integration architecture. His focus is the Infor Cloud platform, helping customers apply core capabilities like ION, IDM, API Gateway, workspaces, and much more to deliver secure, scalable automation. He works closely with organizations to design integration strategies that are both technically sound and practical to implement. And on a completely unrelated note, I happen to know he's still quietly celebrating Team USA taking home the gold. Brandon, we're looking forward to the session. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ray. I appreciate the invite for this. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about one of my favorite subjects, APIs. If you're not too familiar with APIs, this session will be from a beginning stage to an end stage, an advanced stage of the APIs. So what is an API and what is the API Gateway? Well, the API Gateway, as you can see on my screen here, is an intelligent repository for internal and external endpoints. Using REST or Swagger 2.0 or Open API Specifications 3.0, admins can test full APIs and validate results. This is helpful when needing to map an API response to a BOD or business object document as attributes or parameters. Ion API can support SOAP or REST, but is best suited for REST as the Swagger doc allows for API testing. And we will discuss more about what Swagger doc really is. But admins can easily add external APIs like Neutrino, Microsoft, UPS, USPS, FedEx, just to name a few, within this API gateway. The API gateway also adds a completely secure layer for all calls using OAuth 2 access tokens. This will allow external access for vendors or outside companies to securely access any API suite within the gateway. And it gives REST API access to applications that you purchase for your Infor Cloud platform that are including but not limited to your ERP, IDM or Infor document management, Ion, Mongoose, and Gen AI. Now that we've kind of touched base a little bit about APIs, I just want for everyone's sake to be aware that the world really runs on APIs. When you open up your phone for a social media application, it's going to be calling APIs in the back end to get and receive and maybe even update information that you're doing for that application. So this is what you're seeing, my Tridex tenant, in which we utilize to build out test integrations or different external integrations that some of my customers have requested. We try to use this as just really a full development environment. So you may see duplicate suites or interesting names within here, but my intent is to show quite a bit of the different suites that I have available within my environment. The first thing that we're going to do is look at the Infor BAS services, which stands for Backend as a Service. It is a component that you can add on to your tenant from Infor. You can talk to your rep about that, but I have developed a small BAS service to help provide authorization for Power BI from within the Infor Cloud platform. So when I open this up, I could click on it, and this is really where the Swagger doc comes into play. And as I mentioned before, there are the two different versions, the Swagger 2.0 or the Open API Specifications 3.0, which you could see labeled up here in the green as OAS 3. So I built this Swagger doc as Backend as a Service really built this Swagger doc using Open API Specifications 3.0. And the great thing about Swagger documentation is that you can click a button that says try it out, and you can put in some values within the parameter queries that we have here and even executes. I will not be doing that on this one, but we will see some more examples down the line. And all three of these are really called query parameters. So when we look at this API endpoint specifically, the BAS service is a suite, and then this one call is an endpoint. The full endpoint for my environment would start here, and then it would continue on down here with the / PBI off, PBI, and embed. And then the query parameters add a question mark on the end. And you'll see here, once we execute some of these, that you can also retrieve the full endpoint information from within the Swagger doc. Now to jump back, we will take a look at the Infor provision suites. These are all going to be provisioned by Infor directly, and they are tied to the applications that you have within your environment. So as you can see, we have the burst endpoint here. If I open that up, we'll then have a selection of different endpoints that we could select. Some suites have multiple different endpoints that they may support or allow. And once we open that up, We now see all of the Swagger doc for this endpoint. And if you notice, the first thing you may notice are all these different colors. Each one of the colors is really tied to what they call a verb, which is the action that you're doing for the API call, which could be get or post or put, delete. There could be even more. Some endpoint suites may have all of these different verbs being used, and some may just have post, and you'll see that as we go through some of these. So if we take a look at this one and try it out, you'll notice there's no parameters to put in. It's just a get, and all we have to do is execute. So once we execute this, the first thing that gets built is the curl message, which is a way to call API from code. You'll see the full endpoint that's for this call, and then you'll see some header parameters along with the bearer token and the full URL in which we are requesting. Down in this section, we will start to see what's called the response code. 200 means that it's valid and data came back. 201 is successful and no data. And there's more, could be more codes in that 200 range. And then you may also receive 400, which is usually some type of authorization failure, or 500, maybe a sequence of gateway timeouts or some other potential items. But in this case, we had a 200 response, and here is the JSON response body that we are looking at. JSON is primarily the language used for APIs within a REST authentication, but we will show the XML types here later on. All right. If we go back to the list of available APIs, we'll have several more, including Infor's Gen AI APIs, in which they've added to integrate generative AI skills within your portal. IFS stands for Infor Federation Services. That's going to be the security module within Infor OS as a whole, and that's where you'll add your users, your federated security, your groups, or anything like that. And this is another application that will have APIs. So not only will these APIs be potentially used within the gateway on adding specific tasks from a tertiary application, but you can also use them within an outside developing tool or an internal developing tool, or even Ion, which we will show and discover later on in this sequence. You can see that there's more verbs in here, and there's quite a few different APIs, and they put them into sections like IFS user. So it does help to categorize the section or the endpoint that you're going for. Some of these lists may get big. You can always do a Control F, and you can try to search for specific endpoints that you may need to see if the list is too long, just to throw that out there. There's also the Infor AI platform. So if you are developing any models with prediction endpoints or EasyML, all of those endpoints will be published within the AI platform. API flows is something that Infor only provisions if you create an API flow. And I think it's important to touch on API flows when we're talking about the gateway. But as you can see here, we have documentation for it. And this is for orders. We have some query parameters along with an input request body that could send information to an API flow that's been published. If you're not familiar with API flows, you could come into Ion and you can go to the Connect menu and API flows to view what you have or create new ones. In the case of my environment, I only have 2 active, and that's why you see those 2 available endpoints. But if we take a look at an API flow, it's a way to publicly expose an API that may do multiple actions. In this case, this is getting an item description for a product, and then it's also getting a price for that product. those are two calls in the system, and you don't really want to expose those two calls to one of your customers to be able to get that information. So you can securely expose it as two calls in the back end to where they provide specific information, maybe even a specific GUID instead of a customer ID. And you would transform that, make the call, and then as well, you can dictate what API response data comes back. Maybe the get price call has more pricing details that you don't want to expose. You have full capabilities to be specific in what you set for the response output for what that caller of the API can see. This is more of a simplistic API that I've created, but we also have a more advanced API with some JQ transform tests and set variables. We have a proof of delivery application, and in order to assign the deliveries to the driver in the mobile app, we need to have the ability to create the orders and then get them in a stage to where they've been essentially put on the truck for the delivery. And this API flow will go through, create the orders, take it off of credit release if it's there. It prints a pick ticket, and then it checks the stage to ensure it's in the right stage. And in the distribution ERP, there's a TWL module in which you could drop the orders. And once they're dropped, then our developers can quickly utilize this for testing and adding to the mobile app. So this is a more complicated API flow, but I just like to show it because it shows the capabilities of what you can do. It doesn't need to be just one API. It could be, as you can see here, 6 or 7 different API calls. And the data that's being sent and the data that's being received is very specific into what you want to provide for that endpoint. So the fact that these two are active is the reason why we have these two endpoints with documentation Swagger Doc. Now jumping back to ION here, I just want to point out, since we're talking about ION, which is really the intelligent open network in which you can send and receive BODs, business object documents. They don't have to be JSON or XML. They could be very many different types, but this is really where you send and receive data. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this because all of the ERPs have this and use it for BODs. With these, if we trim this down to APIs, this is where you could start utilizing the APIs in the endpoints to build them inside of a flow. So if we go back to like a UPS example where we need tracking information, you could build out the API flow here, the connection point API here, and add it to the data flow to add on to that BOD maybe before it's sent off, or maybe it writes back to the ERP. Another important API that is available inside of the connection points is the IMS via API Gateway. I'll show this a little bit later in Postman and how it's used, but this endpoint allows you to publicly expose an API in which a external entity can submit a BOD to the bus. So using this in a data flow, you would then have the ability for a vendor to send you a supplier invoice, which goes to the ERP. Jumping back to the API gateway here now, we are going to look at next is Infor document management. And we'll take a look at the REST API endpoint. And with IDM, this is obviously where you can manage your documents, add new documents, delete documents, update documents, search for documents. So if we come to, I'm going to use my handy search tool here to search for items. I could try it out. I could put in a X query to look for a specific document and include some parameters. If you notice, it makes it very easy for the different items that you can add. add a translation here for US and execute. You'll notice that this API response actually came back in an XML format. And another great thing about Swagger is that you could change the media type in which you're using. When Infor built out this API for IDM, they built it out with XML originally way back in the day, and then it's transformed to have also the JSON. So if I change that to JSON and re-execute, you'll notice we now have a JSON format document as a response. Then here's all the details of that document. It looks like we also have another document that matches that, but primarily using this to show you the differences between content type items that you may select. They have them on the response, and they will have them also on requests. So if I were to try this out, here's an XML example. I can just change that to JSON, and now I have a JSON example, and I can also change this to JSON, and then I would be able to make this call and get both a request sending as JSON and a response sending as JSON. Scroll back up, and we will go back to the next one, and we'll take a look at non-provision suite. This is really where you're adding a Infor suite for an application that doesn't necessarily exist in the cloud, because Infor adds all of the cloud items. And in our case, we just happen to have the distribution ERP on-prem. So we built a hybrid connection here from the cloud to our on-prem ERP, in which we can make API calls. So that's why we have this. You may not have any direct suites in this label category. Next, we will take a look at the non-Infor suites. So this is going to be a combination of items that either we use for an integration for a customer, or we were just using for testing, or many different purposes. And some of these will be endpoints that have Swagger documentation. So if we take a look at the, if we take a look at the open AWS, S3, this is an endpoint that I built out to drop a document in my S3 bucket. And for this API, I actually had to build out the Swagger documentation for that. And we will touch on how you can do that and truly what that means here in just a moment. We have quite a few different integrations that we've done for channel advisors, among some others. I also have an MS Graph for Microsoft Graph API. Microsoft does provide Swagger Doc in a manner for your endpoint, but I found that the list was too large to put into one suite. So I actually had to take Microsoft Swagger Doc and reduce it down in a manner that allowed me to add Swagger Doc for this particular endpoint. And we can do Teams stuff, we can do SharePoint stuff, and calendar. So this is probably a good opportunity to talk about how that was done. And one thing that I use that I enjoy is SmartBear Swagger Studio. You could go to swaggerhub.com, you create your own account, and then you can utilize this to create or manage your Swagger Doc. In this case, I took Microsoft's and I put it in here, and then I just started deleting endpoints. If I delete that endpoint, you notice it goes away here. I delete that endpoint. This one's going to go away as soon as I do it. And I just worked through the whole list until I had the endpoints that I needed for the particular integration that I was working on. You'll notice this is a Swagger 2.0 version, and there's also an ability inside of the Swagger Hub to convert it from Swagger 2.0 to Open API Specifications 3.0. So this is another Microsoft Graph endpoint in which I utilized the OAS3 to create Swagger Doc, where you can simply export this from here, and jumping back to the API gateway, you can then import it using the documentation edit button. Now, if we back up to the MS Graph auth, this is another Microsoft Graph endpoint that I created using a different grant type. There are several different grant types out there, but in this case, it was specific to authorization code. And if you add an authorization code grant type security inside of your API gateway, an authorization code is actually a web authorization that a user has to go and retrieve. So once you have added an endpoint like this, you could then find the authorizations on the authorizations page. And if you click on it, you'll notice it goes to Microsoft. I authenticate with my Microsoft account. If I have MFA enabled, that would pop up. I don't have to do that right now because I'm logged into this browser already with my Microsoft account. But once it's authorized, we then have the ability to call that MS Graph API using my user authorization. If we take a look at some of the other third-party ones that I have created, Open API is an example of that. Let me sort this by name. Open API has their own set of documents and Swagger Doc that you can use to communicate with OpenAI, sorry. And you can see there's quite a few different ones in here with a pretty large list. So some of them will have a lot of different items that you can utilize. Neutrino is another public one that's common where you need to bring in maybe SMS messaging from within your environment for when an order is being shipped, like we talked about earlier, or many other use cases could come up, along with UPS being here if you need to call UPS APIs for tracking or shipping information or anything else along those lines. All right, and then that is it for these. So now we will jump into the third-party suites. What a third-party suite is actually where Infor already has the Swagger Doc for specific third-party suites that are out there. You could find the suite catalog or the suite template, as they call it, by just clicking the Add button up here in the top left. So all of these options are suites that Infor has already pre-created Swagger Doc for that specific integration or endpoints. And you'll notice they have a very large list within the suite template guide here. So as far as these go, you'll notice that ChatGPT is one of the first ones I have here. So I have set up a integration to ChatGPT to where I can chat with OpenAI and bring back information and utilize that information somewhere within the system or potentially even outside of the system. I'd also like to show DocuSign because this is one of the largest lists of endpoints that I think I've ever seen. But I'm going to use the scroll bar here, and you'll notice there's a lot of information and descriptions within these endpoints that really help guide you on what you need to do, what parameter values are. All of that type of information can be added to this Swagger Doc to make it easier on developers or someone else who may want to utilize these endpoints. And I have two DocuSigns because with DocuSign, you first have to create a test integration and successfully call API endpoints, I believe 10 times. And then once you've done that, you can publish it to production and then start using the actual production endpoint. They also have a couple Salesforce suites, as you saw, and Twilio, another text messaging system, among other things, and even Zoom. And that is the full list of all the different APIs that we have available. Obviously, I did not show them all, but the intent is to show you that it's not just for Infor specific applications. This could be third-party applications, public hosted APIs, getting the weather. There's all sorts of different ones out there that you can utilize to really add on to anything you're doing with Ion, anything you're doing with workspaces and widgets, or potentially anything you're doing outside of the Infor Cloud platform, maybe in an e-commerce site or an employee portal where you want to retrieve information. So this is really a great segue on how to do that and where that really starts. And that's going to be in the Authorized Apps section menu here. We have different types within the Authorized Apps. And like I said, this is for external access to the API Gateway. And you'll notice that there are 4 different mobile ones. If we click on iOS, I have an iOS device myself. There's also a little QR button over here. This QR code allows you to help set up this mobile application by scanning the QR code. It brings in the tenant information and allows the user to then log in using this authorized app. Another authorized app is web application. So this is where you may want to use an authorization mechanism like I showed with Microsoft, where you would log into the service using the web and authorizing your user through that, which we could do in Postman, and I'll show, or we'll talk about Postman here in just a couple minutes. There's also backend service. These are really the most common, I would say, when you're talking about third-party integrations and even development testing. I have this Postman one here. If we open it up, we'll notice that it's been downloaded by several users within my environment, and those are all developer users. So they would download the credentials. You always want to do enable create service account, search for a user, select the user, and download. What that downloads is a file with an Ion API extension that is in a JSON format. You need to be extremely careful with the contents of that file when you are sending to third parties. You don't want to send that in plain text email. You want to send it securely with many different sites they have out there and the capabilities, but the intent is that you're sending username and password and endpoint URL information, that if a nefarious actor were to retrieve that document, then they could call APIs within your gateway and potentially do harm. So be very careful. Don't send it plain text. Don't send it as an attachment. There are ways to securely send that information and the contents of that information. So, excuse me. As far as helping third-party integrators integrate to the API Gateway, which I have done with many different vendors and partners out there, is one of the first things I do is send them this GitHub link, github.com/infor-cloud/ion-api-SDK. So this is the development kit that Infor has put into GitHub to help developers in identifying how to access the API Gateway and what it means to use OAuth authentication with different grant types, how that flow may work, and then also some sample clients that they could download to kind of cheat sheet off of, reverse engineer, and put into their code and be able to call the APIs using this. So I would highly suggest to take a look at this link and utilize this link when communicating with third-party vendors who want to call into your APIs. We didn't really touch on it too much, but security is an important factor in all this. And that just kind of goes back to when you're setting this up, where you can enforce scopes and only allow this authorized app to have access to a specific endpoint and keep their scope to only be able to call those endpoints. As well as when you download the credentials using a service account, it is actually going to be using a user within IFS or a service user within IFS. And the security at that layer adds an additional layer of security for that account and what they can access. If you give them access to IDM, they would need an IDM security role. They may need IDM administrator versus IDM user if they're going to be updating many different document types, or you could potentially create your own security role and trim it down by there. But I just want to get across that with the security mechanisms that Infor has, it allows you to get as granular as you need for the access that will be available for external parties. So once we have the information downloaded, we could go to my Postman application. If you're not familiar with Postman, it's a SDK that allows you to, or I'm sorry, it's IDE really that allows you to call and manage APIs within your environments, and you can add different collections for different customers. But what I want to just show for the purposes of today is first calling the token endpoint. So this is really showing how OAuth 2 works within the API gateway. So I have that Ion API file. I filled in the information for the client ID and some other information, and I could then execute this call. And you'll notice it's very similar to how kind of the Swagger doc worked, where we show the 200 OK, and then we have this API response. So this access token is then what I can use to call any of the other API endpoints in the gateway as long as I have security. So one of the sample endpoints is just the CSD distribution ERP, where I would update the authorization bearer code to what I retrieved in the other window. And then I can execute a quick JSON and I can get a JSON response because that's what the endpoint supports for getting and receiving. And we did touch a little bit earlier on the IMS via API gateway and sending BODs to the ION bus. Once you have that connection point added and in a data flow, you could then use the multi-part message endpoint to send an XML payload with parameters to an ION endpoint, and that would then drop it on the bus. My data flow that is pointing to that connection point, IMS via API gateway, would pick it up and we would do something with it. Maybe it's a supplier invoice and it's going right to your ERP package, and it's just one simple flow and that's all it does. Maybe it's more complicated and there's a workflow with it, with approvals. And if you're not aware of what ION could do, you could do pretty much anything you want. But this is just a really nice API endpoint that got put out there in Infor OS really a long time ago, and it works really well. So I wanted to highlight that for everyone today. Jumping back to the API gateway, the next menu is the Ion API metadata. This is an important screen, especially if you're adding new suites and endpoints. In order to call or retrieve those endpoints from within Ion, you need to have Ion know about the new suite. And there are instances where you may add the suite and you won't see it right away. And that's because of the metadata. You could come in here and you could click on the refresh metadata screen. You'll notice the indexing is triggered, and after a couple minutes, it will be refreshed, and then you should be able to see it within Ion. Just to show you that, if we go look inside of Ion in one of my flows, when you add an API call, this is where the Swagger doc is a must and the API metadata is a must. Once you open up the selection for the operation you want to do, this is when you will be able to identify all of the suites that you have in your environment, like the MS graph that I talked about, Neutrino, all of them show up in here. So if I wanted to make a call through Neutrino, I could click on that. I could click just enter here and it'll search. And here is a shortened Swagger doc version of what we saw in there, where it's really just the endpoint. So once I've selected that and pull it in, that's what allows you to pull it in. This is telling me my Swagger doc is bad, so I probably should have picked another one. But I just wanted to show how the Swagger doc is vital, really, to be able to use any of the API suites within a Ion API connection point. The monitoring tab is as you can imagine, the place where you can monitor all of the API calls happening within your environment. This does not show you the request or the response. It just shows you of when it came in, what it did, and what happened to the target, and how long it took. And the reason it doesn't show you the API request and response is because that could be secure information that you're sending to or from different places. So you don't want to openly just allow any API administrator to look at that. That's really a per application or per ERP thing that you would have to probably get backend logs from. But at least this would show you what's happened within the last 24 hours within your system and all the different calls, who called it, where it came from, what was going on, and how long it took, and even the success code. So here's that 200 API response that we talked about before. I don't know if I have any failures, but we could always try to see. Looks like we do. And here's an example of that 500 error. So this tells me that this call failed. It took 60 seconds here, and that's probably a timeout and probably part of the reason it failed. But utilizing some of this information, you'll be able to go figure out where it's coming from and what is going on. You'll notice that some of these say not available, and that's partly because of the service account that was used when it was downloaded. It should have been selected, and you'll notice some of these other ones also show the client ID to where it came from, which the client ID is a per application authorized app basis. When you create it, it creates a specific client ID. So if you see a bunch of calls coming in from a client ID that you maybe just sent out an email and forgot to encrypt it like I mentioned, and you see a whole bunch of these and there's a bunch of failures, they don't know what the call is, so they're just trying things, then you could go delete that authorized app and then they won't be able to access it. Obviously, there's a problem with them having the URL still and possibly hitting it. That's all things that have to be figured out later on, but there is a good basis here to at least allow you to monitor from a high level all of the API calls going within your environment. All right, authorizations we showed. Backend as a service, this is where your BaaS services will show. As I mentioned, we purchased the BaaS. I created a one service to deploy out there using Node.js, and that's why it shows here. So you may not have BaaS, especially if you don't have it enabled in your tenant or purchased from Infor, you would not have it. And that, I think, really wraps up all of this. And now we are done with the presentation, and we will jump into the live Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandon. That was a great deep dive and a really helpful insight on how organizations can use API gateways effectively. We're going to shift into the live portion of the session and start answering the questions that have been coming in throughout the presentation. We received a lot of great questions, so we'll work through as many as we can in the time we have. If we don't get to your question today, don't worry. Every question that was submitted will be answered and posted to the Infor developer community and afterwards, so everything is captured into one place. We'll transition now to the live screen and get started with your questions. Stay tuned. Great. Again, thanks for staying with us. Let's dive into the questions. Let's see here, Brandon. The first question I have is, when should someone choose Swagger 2.0 versus OpenAPI 3.0 for an API definition?
That's a good question. Actually, Infor, I believe, excuse me, just announced that Open API specifications 3.1 is either now or soon in the April release going to be available. And it sounded like that was partly because of external APIs that they want to communicate with require that versioning. I believe it also sounded like they were going to sunset the Swagger 2.0 capabilities. So really from this point forward, my recommendation would be to use OpenAPI version 3.0 or potentially 3.1 here next month.
Okay, all right. If you have the choice, when do you recommend XML versus JSON for integrations and why?
I think that's a great question as well. And I think it's all dependent on the person who's potentially doing the integration. There's some third-party services out there that already use XML and maybe they're comfortable or more comfortable in that, and it may be appropriate, but it's also going to be endpoint dependent. You may not always see an endpoint with XML capabilities. I showed the IDM one that had both XML and JSON. So in that instance, it's really just going to be dependent on the person doing the integration or possibly the third party.
Okay. What are safe, practical ways to distribute and store the Ion API credentials file securely?
I would highly recommend One-Time Secret. There are other sites out there, but in this case, you can type in your secret message here and set a lifetime and potentially a passphrase. And you can create the link, send that link to someone, tell them the password, and then once they open it, they could copy the details in it, and then the note is destroyed. So there are other services out there, but this is definitely the one I recommend internally for my team.
Yeah, that sounds like a good one. Next question. Is there a developer documentation page for core built-in API functions and endpoints/endpoints?
I am definitely glad that someone asked that. Infor has in the developer.infor hub a API section that you can explore the API docs for the many different Infor applications or ERPs that they have available. So this has been something that they've been working on for quite some time, and they've really done a great job here to help you figure out how to call them. They could even have use cases, exact directions, but it has a more full Swagger documentation, if you want to call it that, really just a more full documentation centered around those specific calls with examples as well. So I would highly recommend checking out the developer portal.
Yeah, I do too. We put a lot of work into that, and it's really a nice product to use, a nice webpage to go to. So,
Absolutely.
Next question: what are the best practices to limit existing APIs? In other words, we want to use a fragment of the CPQ API, but only a selected branch of functions.
That can get challenging depending on specifically how granular you're trying to get. We did discuss this, the scopes when you download the service account. So you could scope the service account to only go to CPQ, but it kind of sounds like to me that you're trying to only go after maybe a specific endpoint within CPQ and not just the whole CPQ environment or suite, if you want to call it that. And that could get a little bit more challenging. The developer portal does have some information on request and response policies, but in my opinion, what I've found best to securely expose API endpoints in a singular fashion is the API flow that we discussed. So this would allow you to expose just one endpoint to that one person and have them pass, like I said before, GUID, validate the GUID correct, make the calls, and then give them the information that they're looking for.
Okay. Next question. What is the simplest method to implement access for OAuth to get access to API for third-party apps?
And that is going to, what is the best option? Access for OAuth. I believe you're talking about the third-party apps here. So if we go look at these, that's always going to be on the third party's side. So for DocuSign, I had to go create a DocuSign account and have a developer account that could call APIs along with the security to make those calls. And then I was able to set up the OAuth authorization specifically for DocuSign. And that goes for Salesforce and Zoom and Twilio. And all that you see here is on the source side, they have to have that OAuth type capability. There's many different OAuth mechanisms that can be used, and they're all defined here in the authentication type for the target endpoint security. Didn't really touch on that during the demo because there's quite a few in here, but there's API keys, there's JWT, as well as OAuth 1 and 2.
Great. Let's see. So many great questions. All right, here's one. This option available for Infor on-prem instance, not Infor OS. Is this option available for Infor on-prem instance, not Infor
Well,
OS?
with Infor OS on-prem and even what was formerly called XI Platform, they have the Infor API Gateway within that Infor OS. But I got a little confused with that question if they say not Infor OS. So if you're talking about maybe just an ERP on-prem, that would be specific to your ERP. For distribution, I know the very old versions, the character versions, and some of the GUI versions have SOAP APIs, which is a different mechanism, but still the same type of functionality where you could call and either send data, update data, or get data. And there's also some newer web version ERPs that I've seen that have REST capabilities and Swagger. The only complication there is going to be that you may not be able to apply specific security to those endpoints. So you'll have to watch out for that. The API Gateway specifically adds on that OAuth layer for all the calls in the environment that allow you to get granular and more secure manner. So it'll be dependent on those. Hopefully that answers that.
Okay. Here's another good one. What is the simplest way to execute external APIs from LN and get results?
So I'm not familiar with LN, but I am familiar with the distribution, as I said, and they have something in there that's called an extension. So you want to extend the screen for order entry. You can write an extension that could call one of these third-party or really any of these suites within the API Gateway because it's all in the Infor cloud. So there are ways to do it with distribution. I do not know about the capabilities with LN.
Okay. So what is the simplest way to execute external APIs from Ion?
From Ion, as I somewhat touched on, you would have to first have the API Gateway suite, all of the authorization or the security set up and working. And then from within Ion, and you select, and just really open up any one of these. When you add an API component, which can be done inside of an API flow, where you can have the connection point APIs, or you can have an API component within a workflow, they all have the ability to select the suite and endpoints through a GUI utility.
Okay. So this is actually a really interesting one. Is it normal for an external call to API flow hold on. Is it normal from an external call to API flow that the time response is much longer than a regular API call? Even in my API flow only has one direct API call with jQuery transformation.
So it sounds like you just have a simple API flow with one API flow and a JQ transform. I don't think it should be slower. I've tested out this flow many times and it has gone through pretty quickly. You may want to use the API monitoring to look at the specific call to see how long it actually took. It could be the call or it could be the JQ transform. That'd be something we probably have to take a closer look at. If you want to post that issue and your API flow in the community, I'd be more than happy to take a look and try to help you out.
Someone asked, what is difference between API flow and workflow? What is the difference between those two?
So an API flow is just that. It's just calling APIs and getting data in and pushing data out. A workflow, I didn't really dive into this too much since it was more API session, but with a workflow, you can also call APIs in it. But the workflow also allows you to create tasks or notifications that could be sent to users to make them do an action and also bring in the whole inbox for the Infor OS portal. So workflow is really more specific to user interaction flows specifically.
Okay. So let me see if I get the end of this one right here. Is there a way we can get a download of the API flow underscore create underscore POD underscore orders?
Certainly. Reach out to me and I'll see what we can do.
Okay. Here's another nice one. Should we expect a third-party vendor to provide the Swagger doc to create their suite? If not, what is the best way to make it?
No, you cannot expect a vendor to do that. I've had, vendors that have full documentation and, tens of thousands of calls, and I've had other third-party vendors that have zero Swagger doc and they just expose the endpoint, and they have very light amount of even data that they could give me to make it all work. But the Swagger Hub is definitely going to be your best way to produce the documentation needed for the API gateway and the suite.
Okay. Brandon, is it possible using API retrieve document from IDM in base 64 format instead of URL link?
I have not figured out a good way to do that. I actually have many different integrations today that pick up documents inside of IDM, and I just use the stream call, and that will produce a binary file of whatever is being picked up. And what I've done with the Ion flow itself, I think I have one I could find in here. Maybe this one. So yes, so what I did inside of the data flow to help with that is we pass in some sort of BOD that has the PID or whatever values needed to get the documentation. And we call that on this top branch of the merge activity. So this is the merge, and you can merge the two documents together using a Python script. So that's the route I've chosen for every integration where I need to send the file somewhere using a base 64 encode is the merge, the advanced script to take the binary base 64, encode it, and put it into the incoming document and moving on to the next step.
Okay. So one of the viewers wants to know if you have implemented a solution where data is pulled from Sightline 10 via API and then posted/written into a Microsoft SQL Server database like ETL, staging, warehouse tables.
So there is the capability in Ion to write to a database and connect to a database through the enterprise connector, and you can execute procedures by passing it XML or really any BOD, JSON or XML, I should say, not any, but those two, and then you can run a SQL statement that can input that data. So it is possible to do, but you're so more asking about an ETL solution for Sightline, and I would not have the knowledge on the Sightline side, but with distribution, all of the distribution tables that you want to use for reporting downstream can be sent to the data lake, right? So Sightline, I believe, the cloud version can send objects to data lake, and then from data lake, there are many different ways to download information using APIs or Compass. And there's also several partners out there that have ETL type tools to help you do that.
Okay. Okay, let's jump into another question here. Is it possible to limit at some point methods from CPQ API for external applications?
I think that's somewhat kind of what we touched on before with the potential of using scopes and or security, the service user specifically, like with distribution, for example, if you're calling the ERP data to create an order, you also pass in an operator. And so in the instance of specific endpoints for CSD, you would just set up the operator with what you want them to be able to call. So if you don't give them access to the order maintenance API, then they won't be able to maintain an order. So it kind of depends. There's many different layers of security, starting from the OAuth 2 here to the service account that's being used, and then furthermore to the tertiary application or ERP package.
Okay. So here's another good one. They're all great though. Have you previously integrated Infor? Wait, did I ask it? Have you previously integrated Infor Skyline 10.0 using APIs? Sightline, sorry. Using APIs to extract operational data like customer orders, inventory, GL, and then insert that data into Microsoft SQL Server tables for reporting, integration, or downstream systems?
Yeah, I guess that was pretty similar to the other one. I don't think Infor has, as far as I know, built any product to utilize APIs for a data warehouse or downstream reporting in a manner where you want to get all of the data. That's really going to be more so a data lake type function where you want to extract the data from there. So as long as Sightline feeds up to data lake, then rather than getting it direct from the ERP, then you would actually get it from data lake. And I know specifically distribution locks down the API, so you can't return, million or 10 million rows for a table in that manner.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way for backend service apps in the API gateway to utilize those custom-built Infor API flows, or are there any restrictions to using only Infor-provided created API suites?
Not that I have found with the BAS. It should be able to call any of the suites that you have within your API gateway.
Okay. Let's see. Let's look for another one. Here we go. Hooking up third-party APIs allows the other Infor apps to be able to call them. Hooking up third-party APIs allows the other Infor apps to be able to call them. I guess.
Yes, I mean, depending on the application, with distribution, you can create an extension to do it. If you're trying to talk about burst calling some other API, I don't necessarily know on that. I think it would be API or app dependent on that app.
Okay. This viewer wants to know how to install all these APIs. In our version of Infor Cloud, the list is really minimal.
Yes. So I assume you're talking about this list and how I have a lot. A big part of that is because we built a bunch of integrations and testing and all sorts of things. Your list probably looks more along the lines of this, but maybe not as large. You should have quite a few of these with any ERP that you purchase with Infor OS. The burst one is something you'd have to have burst for. AI platform, you'd have to actually have an AI prediction, or I guess that's just part of the AI package. Gen AI is one that is an add-on, so you have to purchase the Gen AI potentially through the Velocity package that they have out, and that would be another potential way. But some of these are add-on that we've purchased, like RPA as well. That's an add-on application to Infor OS. So once you purchase the application, they'll provision the suite as well.
Okay. So let's see here. Can you show any example how to integrate with other applications?
That might be a little generic, but if you create a third-party suite like the S3 bucket I pointed out, or Avalara, or even Microsoft, we've also built a Microsoft bot. And so I've created SwaggerDoc for my bot to be able to communicate with it and do a couple things and communicate with people inside of our Teams organization. So if you have the API suite and the documentation all set up, then from within Ion or your ERP package, you can reach those APIs. So that would be the best recommendation for integrating something, whether it's an outside service in, or even an inside service to another inside service, or inside service out, using a document flow of sorts, or even just an API and a time trigger can help you trigger the integration and get data from external or internal sources within Ion.
Okay. Here's a CSD question. Is there a limit on API calls with Infor CSD or a charge based on usage?
So that's another great question there, and not necessarily for CSD, but Infor does have a usage limits document that they've published out. And this will detail all of the usage limits that you have dependent on the Infor OS tier. So everything I've showed today is inside of the API gateway. The API gateway on this line will either have 250,000, 1,250,000, or 6,250,000 executions allowed per day, dependent on, again, the tier of Infor OS that you have.
Okay.
And the concierge also has a usage report screen inside of that can actually show you how many calls you made. I think it's 2 days back, maybe 3, but it goes 3 days back to earlier in time, even last month. So you can actually do comparisons and see your usage for any of these services across the board.
Okay, thank you. See, someone asked, I have a need to build an API for a vendor to query matrix data. However, I want to limit which matrices they have access to.
I guess it depends on where the matrix data is stored. If you stored it inside of a data lake table, there is specific security that you can apply inside of Data Fabric to where you can limit what tables and fields a specific security role group would have in relation to data lake. If you're talking about in an ERP package, then I would assume that the security would be there. Otherwise, potentially an API flow that we showed earlier, where they would pass in their specific custom GUID, and then based on that GUID, you would do very specific calls and give them very specific data.
Okay. Few more questions, and remember, whatever we haven't gone to, They will be posted in the community for community. Next one is BAS would when would BAS be available in cloud?
BAS is available today in cloud, but as I mentioned, it is an add-on component. So you'll want to speak with your rep about the costs associated with that and see if that's a module that you would be interested in purchasing.
Okay. I suppose instead I should be creating a new suite and apply the limitations in the API flows.
Yes, I think that throughout those questions, it sounds like one of those questions is yours, and I believe that kind of helps solidify my point about how strong the API flows can really help control what people have access to when you're talking about external access. Usually with the API gateway, you're giving it to third-party vendors that are e-commerce or controlling your PIM or whatever else, and they kind of have more of an open security module. But maybe for your customers, you don't want to expose everything. You want to give them very specific information, and either the API gateway policies or the API flow would be the best suited for that.
Okay. And the last question for now is, sorry, but not sure you covered this yet, but this is recorded. I'm particularly interested in the Postman stuff.
Yep, absolutely. This is recorded. It will be recorded on YouTube, and you can watch it, play it back from there. I believe.
Also, if you're on ON24, you'll get an email with the details to where to go for the recording. All right. Well, this brings the end of today's live Q&A. Brandon, thank you again for the deep dive and taking the time to walk through all these questions. And thank you all who joined us today and participated. The level of engagement and quality of the questions really made this session valuable. As a reminder, like I said a couple minutes ago, a full recording will be available shortly, along with the Q&A. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye for now. And stay tuned for the next webinar.